On a frozen night on Fifth Avenue, a silent mansion watches the world go by, a house of iron and ice where grief has locked every door. Inside, a widowed magnate lives with a son who has not spoken since his mother's tragic death. And then, a shy Irish maid crosses the threshold, her voice the only warmth in a home that has forgotten how to breathe. One desperate promise will bind them together, forcing a man of steel to wager his heart, and a woman of no name to choose between duty and desire. Tell me, where are you listening from? And what do you love most about historical romances? New York City, the winter of 1883. Snow drifted silently along the cobblestones of Fifth Avenue, settling like ash upon the grand facades of the Gilded Age mansions that lined the avenue like stone sentinels of privilege. Inside one such house, tall, cold, and steeped in shadow, time itself seemed to have paused. The Hawthorne mansion was built of dark grey limestone, its windows tall and narrow like judging eyes, its corridors hushed by heavy carpets and sterner hearts. It was the home of Nathaniel Hawthorne, a man whose name was etched in steel across the city's skyline, but whose private life had collapsed into silence and sorrow. Since the death of his wife nearly a year before, the house had grown still. No laughter echoed through the nursery. No music played in the drawing room. Only the ticking of ornate clocks dared to disturb the quiet. Into this silence stepped Jennifer Marsh, a young woman of 25 with a modest valise, a single pair of gloves, and a heart both anxious and tender. She arrived in the early morning, her breath visible in the cold, her boots damp from the snow. The iron gates had groaned as they opened for her, and the butler who greeted her at the servants' entrance did not smile. No one smiled in this house. Jennifer had been born in the tenements of the Lower East Side, the daughter of Irish immigrants who had not survived the last wave of winter fevers. She had worked since the age of 12, scrubbing steps and polishing silver until her hands cracked. She did not speak unless spoken to, and kept her eyes lowered in the presence of her betters. But there was a gentleness about her, an unassuming grace in the way she moved, in the way her voice softened when addressing the sick or the small, that no training could teach. Mrs. Whitcomb, the senior housekeeper, regarded Jennifer with sharp eyes and little patience. "You'll be in the nursery," she announced briskly, handing her a folded apron and a list of rules. "Master Thomas is 6. Do not speak unless necessary. Do not disturb him if he does not wish it. Do not move his toys." Her voice lowered a note. "And do not look for affection. He hasn't spoken a word in nearly 10 months. The nursery was at the top of the house, a pale blue room faded by time and untouched grief. A large rocking horse stood frozen mid-gallop beside a velvet armchair where no one sat anymore. On the windowsill, dust clung to a small row of wooden soldiers, and in the far corner stood a writing desk once meant for lessons. By the fireplace, a boy sat cross-legged on the floor, his head bent low over a picture book whose pages he did not turn. Thomas Hawthorne was a child, carved from silence. His light brown hair was neatly combed, but lacked the ruffled charm of a boy's play. His eyes, large and grey-blue, were too old for his small face. He glanced at Jennifer once, then looked away. Not a word, not a breath of sound escaped him. Jennifer curtsied with quiet respect. "Good morning, Master Thomas," she said, her voice no louder than a whisper. He did not answer. She did not expect him to. Instead of speaking again, she moved about the room with care. She straightened the bookshelves without touching the book he held. She dusted the windowsill and quietly hummed a lullaby from her childhood, one her mother used to sing as she stirred stew in the evenings. Jennifer did not hum to gain attention, only because the silence pressed against her chest like stone, and the melody felt like a way to breathe. From the doorway, unseen, Nathaniel Hawthorne watched. He had not intended to pause. He had been walking the corridor, reviewing figures from the foundry in his mind, when he heard a sound he had not heard in nearly a year, a woman's voice humming softly in the nursery. A voice that was not his sister's, not a governess's, not stern and measured, but warm, human. He was a man of 39, tall and broad-shouldered, his bearing forged by years in business and burden. Grief had left lines that no tailor could smooth. He was a man who frightened boardrooms with his silence, a man who had lost both sleep and faith the night his wife was taken from him. His gaze, sharp and grey, remained fixed on the figure in the nursery. Jennifer Marsh, the new maid. Not beautiful in the way society praised, but arresting in her stillness. She moved with a kind of reverence, as though the very air were sacred. Her brown hair was pinned into a simple low bun beneath her cap, a few strands escaping by her temples. Her face, heart-shaped and flushed from the climb, held no expectation, only quietness. Thomas shifted on the floor. He tilted his head slightly, just enough to glance toward the humming. For a brief moment, something in his face softened. And that, more than any word, pierced Nathaniel's chest. He stepped back into the hallway, unseen once more. Later that evening, as the sky darkened and snow began to fall again outside the nursery window, Jennifer lit a small oil lamp and continued her tasks. She folded Thomas's nightclothes with gentle hands, her tin brooch catching the light with a dull gleam. The child remained quiet, but when she turned to leave, she noticed the book in his lap had been closed. "Shall I leave the lamp burning, Master Thomas?" she asked softly. A pause, then the faintest nod. Her heart stirred. In the drawing room below, Nathaniel stood by the hearth with a glass of brandy in hand, staring into the fire with eyes that no longer saw flames. He thought of the new maid's voice, of the boy's nod, of the impossibility that flickered through the cold halls of his house like the first crackle of firewood on a long-dead hearth. And for the first time in months, he dared to wonder, was silence the end, or only the beginning? The storm had come without mercy. On the evening of the 5th day since Jennifer's arrival, the skies above New York City cracked open with a violence that rattled the Hawthorne mansion down to its foundation. Fierce winds howled past the tall windows like mournful spirits, and freezing rain lashed against the glass with impatient fingers. Gaslight flickered along the corridors, casting restless shadows against damask-covered walls. In the nursery, the soft glow of a single lamp lit the blue walls and reflected faintly in Thomas's wide, unblinking eyes. He sat stiffly on the floor beside his bed, his hands clutching a small wooden soldier. With each distant roll of thunder he flinched, though he made no sound. Not a whimper, not a cry, only silence, as if his fear had been buried under layers of snow and shame. Jennifer knelt beside him without speaking, her woolen shawl wrapped tightly over her shoulders. The fire crackled behind them, its warmth a small defiance against the storm that raged beyond the walls. She reached for a blanket and gently draped it over his small frame, careful not to startle him. Then, in a voice barely louder than the patter of rain on the panes, she began to hum. It was not a lullaby, but a prayer of sorts, an old Irish tune, once sung by her mother during long winters in a tenement where the windows never quite sealed. The melody rose and fell like breath, soothing in its simplicity. She did not look at Thomas as she sang. She let him come to her in his own time, on his own terms. After several verses she felt it, a shift. Thomas leaned, just slightly, until his small shoulder brushed hers. Her heart swelled, but she did not move. Behind the door, on the other side of the hallway, Nathaniel Hawthorne stood in silence, his hand resting on the carved balustrade of the staircase. He had been on his way to the study, led by habit and unrest, when he'd paused at the sound of music. Not bold or cheerful music, but something softer, something that held sorrow and light. He did not mean to listen, but he did. He watched through the narrow gap in the door as Jennifer wrapped the boy in silence more powerful than speech, an unspoken promise that he was safe. It was then, amid the storm, the flickering firelight, and the fragile hush between two people who had suffered in different ways, that a thought came to him, a thought so reckless, so foolish, so utterly uncharacteristic that it startled him. He stepped back into the corridor, breathless, And for the first time in months, he did not continue toward his study. He turned toward the nursery door. Later, after the storm had passed and the lamps had been dimmed, Jennifer moved quietly through the house, her shift ending for the night. The corridors were empty, save for the faint creaking of the house settling after the battering winds. She had just turned the corner near the staircase when a deep voice stopped her. "Miss Marsh." She turned sharply. Nathaniel stood near the drawing-room door, half in shadow, his hands at his sides. He was not in his evening coat, only his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, his cravat loosened, as if he had forgotten himself. His expression was unreadable, but there was something raw in his gaze, something stripped of formality. "You calmed him," he said. She lowered her eyes. "He was frightened, sir. He has not sought comfort from anyone in nearly a year," he continued, voice low and rough around the edges. "You sang to him?" "Yes." Her voice trembled slightly, but not from fear. "He listened to you." She could not explain what passed between her and the child, no more than she could explain why her own heart had ached so deeply for a boy who was not hers. So she said nothing. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. He took a step forward, the distance between them closing with the weight of something unspoken. "I have tried everything," he said, almost to himself. "Physicians, tutors, specialists who call themselves experts in the minds of children. Nothing has reached him. Nothing has moved him." He looked up then, truly looked at her, and the intensity in his eyes was almost unbearable. "You did," he said. Jennifer swallowed. "I don't know if I—" He cut her off with a single quiet sentence. "If you can make my son speak again, I will marry you." The silence that followed was heavier than thunder. Jennifer stared at him, her mouth slightly parted, the color draining from her cheeks. "I beg your pardon," she whispered. His expression did not waver. "You heard me." She backed a step, her breath catching. "Sir, I am a maid. I am not unaware of that. And you would offer me marriage." Her voice nearly cracked on the word, as if it were something too large for her to say aloud. "I would offer you anything that might bring my son back to the world," he said. "But not love." Her words escaped before she could stop them. He hesitated. "No," he said quietly. "Not love. Not yet." And that honesty, more than any sweet lie, made her knees feel weak. She did not answer. She curtsied deeply, almost as if to hide her face, and fled. By morning, the entire servants' quarters buzzed with the impossible tale. Whispers bloomed like ivy in the kitchens, wound through the scullery, and dripped from the upper halls like candle wax. "A maid married to a hawthorn? Perhaps he's gone mad with grief, or she's bewitched the boy." Mrs. Whitcomb summoned Jennifer to the housekeeper's room, where the windows were tightly shut and the air smelled of ledger ink and boiled starch. "You are not to speak of what happened last night," she said sharply. "To anyone." Jennifer stood still. Mrs. Whitcomb leaned forward. "Whatever you think was offered, it was spoken in the shadow of grief. Don't mistake it for something else. And don't let the other staff fill your head with stories. I didn't ask for it," Jennifer said softly. "No, but the world won't care." She sat back, her voice quieter. "He's a man with power. You are a girl with none. That has never ended well." Jennifer nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere, not on Nathaniel, not even on the servants, on Thomas. He had smiled at her that morning, a shy, almost invisible smile, but a smile nonetheless. And when she'd brought in his tray, he had pointed to the soldier she had cleaned and placed by the fire the night before, then touched her hand as she passed it to him. It was not speech, but it was a beginning. That evening, Nathaniel did not dine in the formal room. He remained in his study, pretending to read, but his eyes never moved across the page. The fire burned low, the brandy in his glass went untouched. He thought of what he had said, not just the words, but the weight behind them. He did not know Jennifer Marsh, not truly. He did not know if she had family or hopes or ambitions. He only knew that she had brought color back into his son's eyes, that when she knelt beside Thomas, the boy no longer looked like a statue. And Nathaniel, who had built his life on iron and reason, had spoken something out loud that neither of those things could explain. He had offered a promise no gentleman should make, yet he did not regret it. Not yet. The wind had shifted. It was not the kind that howled through gutters or rattled shutters. This wind moved quietly, like a cold breath down the back of one's neck. It was the kind of wind that arrived with a name, a past, and eyes that measured before they blinked. Beatrice Hawthorne returned to the family home on a Wednesday morning beneath a veil of snow and expectation. Her carriage, lacquered black and trimmed in polished brass, rolled through the iron gates without hesitation, as though the house had been waiting for her. She stepped out in a cascade of dark silks, her mourning ensemble immaculate despite the passage of months since her husband's death. A sable muff clutched in her gloved hands, a sweeping skirt edged in jet beads, a wide hat adorned with a black feather that trembled with each step. Beatrice looked every inch the widow of society's higher order, and her presence froze the very air in the entrance hall. Nathaniel met her at the door, offering a stiff embrace. His eyes, grey and tired, searched her face for softness, but found only calculation. "I came as soon as I could," she said, removing her gloves with slow precision. "I read about the storm in the Herald. I feared the roof might cave in." "The roof held," he replied. "Even so, the house cannot, not if rumors carry weight." He did not answer. Behind them, a young maid paused mid-step on the stairs. Jennifer held a folded linen bundle, her gaze fixed on the woman now removing her coat and handing it to the butler as though the world owed her reverence. Beatrice turned her head just slightly, and Jennifer, feeling that invisible lash of scrutiny, lowered her eyes and disappeared down the back staircase. Beatrice said nothing, but her lips curved upward in a smile that never touched her eyes. By mid-afternoon, the staff moved with sharper corners, silver trays clattered more loudly than usual. Footsteps echoed through the halls with careful restraint. It was as if the house itself held its breath under Beatrice's gaze. In the drawing room, she sipped her tea with one hand and read the house's energy with the other. "She's the one, isn't she?" Beatrice said without lifting her eyes from her cup. Nathaniel looked up from the hearth. "Who?" "The girl, the one in grey." Her tone was flat. Not cruel, not yet, but sharpened with knowledge. "She's the new maid," he replied evenly. "Miss Marsh. Charming surname." Beatrice set her cup down with a delicate clink. "The staff speak of her with reverence. A girl who folds linens and hums lullabies and somehow bends your son's world back into shape. That is no small feat." Nathaniel remained silent. Of course, the effect she has had on Thomas would be more remarkable if it weren't whispered alongside the suggestion that she has also affected you. He turned his face to the fire, the orange glow casting shadows along his jaw. Beatrice rose. Her silks whispered as she crossed the room. "You are grieving, Nathaniel. You seek answers in impossible places, but you must not forget who you are or what our name means to this city." His eyes lifted then, sharp, cold, unyielding. "I have not forgotten who I am." "But she will," Beatrice said softly. "When the invitations stop arriving, when the shareholders grow uneasy, when the child of your house is called a bastard by men who wear gloves at dinner." The words struck like frost against warm skin. Nathaniel said nothing, and Beatrice left him to the silence she had brought with her. Elsewhere in the house, Jennifer moved through the library with a duster in hand and a careful step. She had been sent by Mrs. Whitcomb to clean the bookcases, an unusual task, one typically left to the upper maids. But the house was unsettled by Beatrice's arrival, and routines were shifting. The library was a grand room, panelled in walnut, with high ceilings and a faint smell of pipe tobacco and parchment. She moved slowly, her fingers grazing the spines of volumes she could not afford to read. On the far side, behind a writing desk near the window, sat a smaller cabinet filled with children's books and notebooks. It had once belonged to Eleanor. As she wiped the dust from the drawer handles, she noticed one was slightly ajar. Curiosity, or something gentler, compelled her to open it fully. Inside lay a small silver locket, its chain coiled beside a folded note. She touched it reverently, her breath catching as she opened the clasp to find a miniature portrait, a woman with eyes like Thomas's, hair pinned in soft curls, and a faint smile that seemed to whisper of memories never shared. Eleanor. The note was yellowed at the edges but clear in its handwriting. For Thomas, when he is ready. Jennifer held the locket in her palm, its weight far heavier than silver. She stood there for several minutes, unmoving, until the sound of approaching footsteps stirred her back to herself. She tucked the locket into the hidden pocket of her apron, folded the note gently, and closed the drawer with care. That evening, Nathaniel summoned Jennifer to the library. She entered cautiously, her eyes adjusting to the flickering lamplight, her breath catching at the sight of him seated in a velvet armchair beside the fire. He did not rise, but gestured to the chair opposite him. "I would like your help," he said without preamble. "With Thomas. I want him to spend time in this room, among books. He used to love stories." Jennifer nodded slowly. "If he's willing." "I believe he will be," Nathaniel replied. "But only with you here." She sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap. "What would you have me do, sir?" "Read to him. Encourage him to point, to follow, to feel like this room belongs to him again." She paused. "It won't cause offense?" Nathaniel's eyes flickered. "To whom?" "To your sister, sir." His expression darkened, though his voice remained even. "My sister has opinions. They are neither binding nor always welcome." She hesitated again, unsure whether his words were meant as comfort or warning. But in his eyes she saw something unexpected. Not command, not indulgence, trust. And that, from a man like Nathaniel Hawthorne, was far more intimate than kindness. Over the days that followed, Jennifer returned to the library with Thomas in tow. He came in silence, his small hand gripping hers, his grey-blue eyes scanning the shelves with wary recognition. Jennifer sat beside him on the carpet, opened books filled with animals and ships, and read in a voice just above a whisper. He did not speak, but he leaned against her shoulder. He followed the words with his eyes. Behind the desk, Nathaniel watched, sometimes from the window, sometimes from the armchair, always with a gaze that softened just slightly when Jennifer brushed Thomas's hair aside or laughed under her breath at a mispronounced word. Beatrice noticed. She noticed the growing frequency of Jennifer's presence in rooms she was never meant to enter. She noticed the flicker of Nathaniel's gaze when Jennifer passed through the hall, the faint nod he gave her in the morning, the way he stood a breath longer at the nursery door after Thomas had gone to sleep. One afternoon, as Jennifer crossed the foyer carrying a tray of books, Beatrice stopped her. "You've made quite an impression," she said, her smile brittle. Jennifer curtsied. "I only do what's asked of me, ma'am." "Of course you do." Beatrice stepped closer, her perfume faint but icy. "But you must understand, Miss Marsh. Devotion can be misread, especially when offered in places where it has not been earned." Jennifer said nothing. Beatrice's eyes narrowed. "A girl in your position must be very careful. Favor turns quickly to gossip, and gossip in this house has sharp teeth." Jennifer held her breath, bowed again, and continued down the hall. But in the hidden fold of her apron, the silver locket rested against her heart, and for the first time since arriving, she wondered if something truly dangerous had begun to bloom. Not scandal, but love. The snow did not let up. It fell in delicate flurries at first, like scattered lace upon the city's shoulders, then heavier, blanketing the avenues, weighing down the bare trees, and silencing the horses' hooves along Fifth Avenue beneath a quiet hush of white. Inside the Hawthorne mansion, the fire burned steadily. Its warmth softened the edges of the vast, stone-walled rooms and cast flickering shadows along the corridors. But the truest light came not from flame or lamp, but from something far more fragile, the quiet bond forming between a silent child and the maid who had dared to kneel beside him. Thomas, once hidden in silence like a sealed letter, had begun to move with new intent. His steps, though small, carried direction. He sought Jennifer's company, his fingers brushing hers when she handed him a book, his eyes lifting to meet her face when she entered the room. He no longer flinched at laughter or turned away from her voice. He followed her like a shadow that, after long hesitation, had finally chosen to rejoin the sun. Each day, in the library, they would sit beside the fireplace on the thick red carpet, Jennifer in her modest grey cotton dress and apron, Thomas in his velvet sailor suit, the lace collar slightly rumpled, his cheeks flushed from the heat. She read aloud from fairy tales and picture books, her voice gentle and unhurried, letting him rest his head against her side when the words became too many or the room too quiet. One morning, while they sat with an illustrated volume of Aesop's fables, Nathaniel entered the room, not as master, but as father. His steps were light, careful. He paused just inside the door, unnoticed at first. The boy was watching Jennifer, his small lips forming silent shapes as she read aloud the tale of the fox and the grapes. And then it happened. A laugh, quiet, quick, a breath of sound more felt than heard. Thomas placed his hand on Jennifer's sleeve and pointed to the fox's long nose on the page, his shoulders shaking with amusement. Jennifer's hand froze mid-page, her heart rising into her throat. She turned slowly and smiled at him, not daring to speak, not daring to crush the moment with words. Nathaniel saw everything. He moved forward, and as Jennifer lifted her head, their eyes met. For a moment neither of them spoke. His expression, usually carved in restraint, softened in the firelight. The sight of his son's joy, and the woman who had brought it forth, rendered him silent in the way that only awe can. "May I join you?" he asked, his voice low. Thomas looked up at him and nodded. So Nathaniel sat, not in the high-backed chair by the hearth, but beside them, cross-legged on the carpet like a man who had long forgotten how to do such a thing. He took the book when Jennifer offered it, their fingers brushing, a shock of warmth passing between them. She sat back and watched him read to his son, and the way Thomas leaned toward the sound of his father's voice, the way Nathaniel stumbled once over a word and laughed, low and surprised at himself, it all felt like some dream the house had never dared to dream. But dreams, as Jennifer knew too well, were fragile, and Beatrice was watching. The following day she summoned the staff and announced with practiced elegance that the household would host a formal dinner by week's end. "It is time," she said, "that we remind our neighbours that the Hawthorne name still means something." Her gaze lingered a breath too long on Jennifer, who stood quietly among the maids. By Friday evening the house had been transformed. Chandeliers were polished to near blindness. The drawing-room gleamed with gold-rimmed glassware, and the dining table, long and severe, was set with bone china imported from Limoges. Footmen in black waistcoats moved like shadows. The scent of roast duck and Madeira sauce drifted up the stairwells, mingling with candle wax and ambition. Jennifer had been instructed to serve, not in the kitchen, but at the table. Her hands trembled as she tied her apron anew, the starched linen stark against her modest gown. She had never served in the presence of New York's elite, never stood within earshot of those who dined beneath portraits worth more than her life. Yet Mrs. Whitcomb had given the order directly, with a look that held no room for protest. And so Jennifer moved through the dining room with careful steps, her tray held level, her chin low, while 20 eyes, bright, painted, and merciless, glanced her way. Nathaniel sat at the head of the table. He wore black with a dark cravat, his hair combed neatly, his expression distant. Yet when Jennifer entered, his gaze followed her. Once, then again, like a man betrayed by instinct. Beatrice, seated to his right, lifted her glass. "Nathaniel," she said, her voice light, "do you remember Miss Ashbury?" The woman at her side smiled, young, golden-haired, with gloved hands that clutched her napkin as though it were a bouquet. "Of course," Nathaniel said evenly. "She's recently returned from Paris," Beatrice continued. And her family has expressed great admiration for your recent acquisition of the Brooklyn refinery." Miss Ashbury laughed delicately. "Your steel supports half the city, Mr. Hawthorne. I dare say your name will soon appear on buildings as often as the architects." The room chuckled. Jennifer stood behind Miss Ashbury with the decanter, her eyes fixed on the glass. Her hands poured steadily, though her heart pounded. The words floated above her like smoke. "Do you plan to host more events now that the year is turning?" Miss Ashbury asked. "That depends," Nathaniel said. "On what?" He looked up then, past the silver, past the crystal, to where Jennifer stood. Their eyes met, just once. "On whether the house feels like home again." A silence fell, brief but weighted. Beatrice intervened swiftly. "And Miss Ashbury plays the piano beautifully. We must have music again in this house." "I no longer keep a pianist on staff," Nathaniel replied. Miss Ashbury's smile faltered. Jennifer turned away to hide the heat rising in her cheeks. The rest of the evening unfolded in glances and whispers. "Is she the nursery maid? I heard she sings to the child." More than sings, some say. Jennifer moved through it all like a ghost. When the final course had been cleared and the brandy poured, she escaped to the servants' corridor. Her breath came in short gasps, her chest tight. She found a quiet corner near the back stairs and pressed her hands to her face. Footsteps approached. It was Mrs. Whitcomb, her voice firm, not unkind. "He's refused to come down," she said. Jennifer looked up, confused. "Master Thomas," the housekeeper clarified. "He's in the nursery. The governess couldn't coax him. He only asked for you." Jennifer stood at once. She climbed the stairs slowly, the din of the dinner fading behind her. At the top, the nursery door was ajar. Inside, the fire burned low, casting long shadows on the carpet. Thomas sat by the window in his nightclothes, staring at the snow. She crossed the room and knelt beside him. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know I would have come sooner." He turned to her, his small hand reaching for hers. She held it tightly. In that quiet, surrounded by firelight and snow, they remained, two souls bound not by blood or name, but by something older than both, a kind of truth, one that could not be served on silver trays or spoken in candle-lit rooms, only felt, only kept. The morning after the dinner arrived veiled in fog and silence. A thin film of frost coated the windows of the Hawthorne mansion, as if the house itself had exhaled during the night and never drawn breath again. Jennifer stood alone in the maidservants' corridor, her fingers clutched around the envelope she had written in candlelight hours before dawn. Her script was modest, deliberate. Her name, Jennifer Marsh, signed at the bottom in careful curves. She did not wait for courage. Courage, she had learned, did not arrive. It had to be carried in shaking hands. She descended the stairs toward Mrs. Whitcomb's office, the note pressed flat against her chest beneath her apron. The hallway was empty, save for the ticking of the long-case clock, the kind of silence that follows humiliation, and the echo of 20 unspoken truths. At the threshold of the parlor she paused. A voice, small, urgent, pierced the hush. "No." She turned. Thomas stood at the base of the staircase, barefoot in his nightshirt, clutching the carved wooden soldier she had returned to him days ago. His eyes were wide, panic blooming in them like a storm. And then he moved. He ran. Jennifer dropped the envelope. The child collided with her, arms winding around her waist, face buried in her apron. He trembled, not from cold, but from knowing. Knowing what departure meant, knowing what it felt like when someone you loved walked away. She bent to him, pressing her palm to his back. "I wasn't going to leave you," she whispered, her throat tight with the lie. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. Nathaniel appeared, still in shirt-sleeves and vest, his hair slightly unkempt. His eyes flicked from Jennifer to his son, and the moment froze. "You were leaving," he said softly. Jennifer straightened, her fingers still woven in the boy's. "I had only written a letter." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Was it a farewell?" I thought it best. No, for whom? The question lingered, and neither of them answered. He looked down at Thomas, still clutching Jennifer's skirt like a lifeline. He hasn't clung to anyone like that since Eleanor. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. And now? You would go? Jennifer met his gaze. Because of what they said, because of how they looked at me last night, because of what it means to stay. Nathaniel's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with the weight of restraint. I will not let this house, he said, or its ghosts, rob him of you. He bent and lifted his son gently, who did not resist. Nathaniel's hand brushed Jennifer's as he rose, and that single touch carried the force of an unsaid promise. A tremor of emotion passed between them, grief, defiance, and something else, something neither of them could name yet. Jennifer did not leave that morning. That night, the storm returned, not of wind or weather, but of questions that arrived inside envelopes sealed in wax. A letter was delivered to Nathaniel's study as he sat alone at the hearth, firelight flickering across the brass accents of his desk. He broke the seal with the side of his thumb and unfolded the paper with the weariness of a man accustomed to difficult news. It was from Edward Silburn, a major investor in the Hawthorne foundries. The message was terse. Concerns had arisen regarding the appearance of impropriety within your domestic arrangements. Rumours had begun to circulate at the club. There were whispers of a maid positioning herself near the boy, of Hawthorne himself indulging sentimental delusions. If such distractions could not be contained, Silburn would be forced to reconsider the terms of their contract. Nathaniel read it twice, then folded it with surgical precision. His hand gripped the edge of the desk, not in rage, but in recognition. The world had not changed. It still punished softness. It still devoured women who dared rise above their assigned place. And it would not hesitate to consume Thomas too, should his healing be declared inconvenient. Later that night, Nathaniel left his study and walked the house in silence. The corridors glowed with low lamps. The hallways echoed with distant winds that crept through the seams of stone. He found Jennifer in the servants' parlour. The fire there was modest. She sat near it, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. A quiet dignity surrounded her like a shawl, woven of things never spoken. Her gaze rose as he entered, and something flickered in her eyes. Not surprise, but the quiet ache of someone expecting a blow and bracing for it. He sat across from her, not with the command of a master, but the weariness of a man unarmored. They've begun to speak of you, he said. I know. He paused. I received a letter. She did not flinch. And what did it say? That my behavior places our future in jeopardy. His tone was level, but the shadows beneath his eyes gave him away. She looked into the fire. Then send me away. No. Jennifer turned to him slowly. You may lose your contracts, your standing, everything you've built. Nathaniel leaned forward. What I've built means nothing if it cannot protect the one person who brought life back into this house. The room held its breath. He looked at her, truly looked. Her face, shadowed by firelight, seemed carved of softness and will. Her hazel eyes glistened, not with tears, but with unspent emotion. I haven't laughed, he said quietly, since before Eleanor died. Not once, not truly, until you came. Jennifer swallowed. Her hands clenched in her lap. You have no idea, he went on, what it means to see my son lean into someone without fear, to hear him breathe more deeply when you enter the room, to feel, for the first time in months, like this house might be more than just a tomb with warm walls. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Nathaniel stood slowly. He moved to the hearth, placed one hand against the carved stone, and looked down into the flames. I meant what I said, he whispered. I didn't understand the depth of it then, but I meant it. She rose, her steps hesitant. And what is it you mean now? He turned. The fire cast his face in golden relief, but it was the look in his eyes that undid her, an expression not of power, but of surrender. He stepped toward her. Her breath caught. His hand rose, slowly, to touch her cheek. He stopped an inch away. Permission. She did not move. His fingers brushed her skin, tentative, reverent, as though he touched something sacred. Her eyes fluttered closed. The space between them narrowed, charged with heat and restraint. His forehead nearly touched hers. Their breath mingled. His thumb brushed a tear she had not realized had fallen, and then a soft knock at the door. Mrs. Whitcomb. They stepped apart as though scorched. The door opened halfway. The housekeeper said nothing, only looked at Jennifer, and then at Nathaniel. Her face was unreadable, but her silence spoke volumes. Without a word, she closed the door. Jennifer stepped back, breathless. Nathaniel's voice, when it came, was low. "Forgive me." She shook her head. "There is nothing to forgive." But as she left the room, her heart beat with the ache of 1,000 questions. In the stillness behind her, Nathaniel remained near the fire, staring at the place where her shadow had just been. The fire had not gone out, but it burned differently now, not with destruction, with longing, contained. For now, snow clung to the tall windows of the Hawthorne mansion like a second layer of glass, softening the sharp outlines of the world beyond. The city was quieter now, blanketed and hushed, as if all of New York were holding its breath beneath winter's heavy hand. Inside the nursery, the fire whispered, low and constant, and the air smelled faintly of lavender and beeswax. Jennifer sat on the edge of the carpet, with Thomas curled beside her, his head resting against her lap, his breath warm against the fabric of her skirts. He had grown used to her presence, more than that, dependent on it. He followed her through the house, like a shadow softened by affection. In the evening hours, when the world darkened and the other servants vanished into kitchens and sculleries, he clung to her stories like a lifeline. This night was no different. She read slowly from a worn, leather-bound book of fables, her voice soft and even. Thomas's fingers played idly with the edge of her apron, and when she paused mid-sentence to turn the page, he shifted, his small voice barely audible above the fire's crackle. "Mama was crying." Jennifer froze. She looked down at him, her heart suddenly pounding in her throat. Thomas's eyes were open, fixed on the fire. He spoke again, no louder, but with unmistakable clarity. She was crying. The night she left. Jennifer placed the book aside gently and cupped his cheek. "Do you remember what happened?" He didn't nod. He didn't blink. "She was angry, and Papa, he shouted. I heard them." His voice was uneven, broken at the edges. "Then she said she'd go alone, and I wanted to tell her I was sorry, but I didn't." Jennifer swallowed the knot in her throat. Thomas turned to her then, his grey-blue eyes wet, but not yet crying. "I thought it was my fault, that if I'd been quiet or better, she wouldn't have left." "No," Jennifer whispered. She pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly. "No, darling, it wasn't your fault, not ever." "I didn't say goodbye," he murmured against her shoulder. She rocked him gently, back and forth, as tears slipped silently down her cheeks. And then, remembering the note she had tucked away, the silver that had rested against her own heart for days, she reached into the pocket of her apron. "Thomas," she said softly, "there's something I found. It was hidden in a drawer your mother used to keep by the window. I think she meant it for you." She placed the locket in his hands. He opened it slowly, his fingers trembling. Inside, the miniature portrait of Eleanor smiled gently from the frame, her painted eyes filled with grace. Beside it, the folded scrap of paper. "For Thomas, when he is ready." His breath hitched. He clutched the locket to his chest and let out a sound Jennifer had not heard from him before. Not a word, but a sob. A soft, aching sob that broke like a thaw inside his small body. He cried, not like a child throwing tantrum, but like a boy who had carried a grief too large for his age and had finally found permission to let it go. Jennifer held him until the sobs faded into hiccups, and the hiccups into sleep. She placed a quilt over his shoulders and kissed his forehead before leaving the nursery. Her footsteps echoed down the hall, light but heavy with the weight of the moment. In the study, Nathaniel sat in his leather armchair, a decanter of brandy untouched beside him, a fire burning low in the hearth. The shadows across his face made him look older, wearier, like a man made of stone with fire only faintly flickering beneath. Jennifer knocked once and entered. He rose slowly, surprised by her expression. "He spoke," she said, her voice unsteady. "He remembered." Nathaniel took a breath as though bracing himself. "He remembered you and Eleanor arguing," she continued, "that night." His eyes closed for a beat. "I thought he'd been asleep," he murmured. Jennifer stepped closer. He thought it was his fault, that if he'd been better, quieter, she wouldn't have left. Nathaniel sat back down, covering his mouth with his hand. His shoulders shook, not with tears, but with the weight of shame. "I never wanted him to hear," he said after a moment. "We argued because I wanted to send him to school in Boston. Eleanor wanted to keep him close. I accused her of coddling him. She accused me of trying to control everything." He stared into the fire. "She left to cool her temper, not to abandon us. I told her not to go. The horses were restless from the storm, the driver hesitant. But she insisted." His voice broke then, the memory too sharp. "She died 2 streets away when the carriage overturned." Jennifer lowered herself to the chair across from him. "You blame yourself." He nodded. "But now I know. He does too." They sat in silence, the only sound the low snap of a log collapsing in the hearth. "She gave him a locket," Jennifer said softly, "with a note. She meant for him to find it. It said, 'For Thomas, when he is ready.'" Nathaniel turned to her, his eyes rimmed with unspoken emotion. "And was he?" Jennifer smiled through her tears. "Yes, tonight he was." Upstairs, Thomas slept for the first time in months, without clinging to his soldier or flinching in his dreams. Downstairs, in a room lit by fading firelight and memory, Nathaniel reached across the space between them and took Jennifer's hand. The gesture was simple, but in the quiet, it felt monumental. He did not speak. He only held her hand, and in the way his thumb brushed the back of her fingers, in the way his shoulders lowered and his breath deepened, she understood. He was thanking her, not just for the boy, but for saving what was left of the man. Elsewhere in the mansion, the ticking of the hall clock was interrupted by the quiet opening of a door. Beatrice, shrouded in a black wool shawl, stood in her bedchamber with a letter in hand. Her expression was unreadable. The room behind her was spotless, austere. She moved to the writing desk and dipped her pen in ink. By lamplight, she signed her name at the bottom of the letter and folded it once. It was addressed to the family solicitor. Its contents were damning. A formal petition for guardianship, on grounds that Nathaniel Hawthorne was emotionally compromised, overwhelmed by grief, and recklessly influenced by an unvetted servant whose affections are questionable and whose intentions remain unclear. She sealed the letter with a long, deliberate press of wax. As the flame of the candle flickered beside her, Beatrice sat back and watched it burn. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply waited. Because in her mind, the house still belonged to her family, to its name, to its legacy, and no maid, however gentle, however loved, would take it from her without a fight. Not while she could still wield a pen. Not while the law still bore her surname. The sky hung low above Fifth Avenue, veiled in pale grey, as if mourning some secret loss. The chimneys of the Hawthorne mansion exhaled thin streams of smoke into the cold air, and the great house, with its silent corridors and gilded shadows, seemed more a monument than a home. Yet within its walls, the silence had begun to change. Not all silence is stillness. Some silence bears weight, some silence threatens to speak. Jennifer moved through the house that morning with deliberate grace, her linen apron crisp, her steps measured, her face as serene as porcelain. But inside her, a storm gathered. The conversation from the night before lingered in her chest, beating just beneath her collarbone. The boy's sobs, the silver locket in his small hand, the way Nathaniel had looked at her by the fire, his fingers brushing hers with reverence and restraint. She had touched something sacred, and now Someone meant to take it from her. Beatrice summoned her before the morning bell. The drawing room, always immaculate, now felt like a trap cloaked in civility. Heavy drapes filtered what little daylight entered, and a single crystal lamp glowed on the escritoire. Beatrice stood near the fireplace, her posture flawless, her hands clasped over her abdomen as though she were about to deliver a sermon. "Miss Marsh," she said without preamble. "Come in." Jennifer obeyed, folding her hands before her, her heart pounding beneath her bodice. "I won't insult you with pretense," Beatrice began. "You and I both know what you're doing. And we both know where it will lead if it isn't stopped." Jennifer held her gaze. "I'm doing nothing, ma'am, but caring for the child entrusted to me." Beatrice laughed softly, though there was no amusement in it. "Don't insult me, or yourself." She moved to the escritoire and opened a velvet case, withdrawing a small envelope and a folded letter. "This is a reference," she said, "signed by me. Glowing, I might add. It speaks of your devotion, your discretion, your admirable conduct. It is addressed to a family in Boston. They seek a governess for their daughters, wealthy, quiet people with no connection to this city. The pay is generous, the accommodations private, and the distance ideal." She placed the envelope on the table beside her. "This," she continued, "is a banknote, enough to ensure you'll never have to scrub another floor again." Jennifer's face did not change. "You may take both. Leave this house by Sunday," Beatrice said, her voice smooth as lacquer. "There will be no scandal, no disgrace. Your dignity will remain intact, and more importantly, my nephew's." Jennifer's voice, when it came, was quiet but unshakable. "No," Beatrice blinked. "Excuse me? I will not leave him," Jennifer said. "Not for money, not for reputation, and certainly not to ease your discomfort." Beatrice's mouth tightened. "I have given him nothing but care and kindness," Jennifer went on, "and I have asked for nothing in return." Beatrice stepped forward, her eyes flashing. "Then allow me to make this clear," she said, her voice now edged in steel. "If you refuse this offer, I will not sit idle. I will not let this house become the subject of ridicule. I will write to the papers. I will speak to the magistrate. I will have you removed on charges of impropriety, of manipulation, of taking advantage of a grieving child and a grieving man. Do you think your word will stand against mine?" Jennifer said nothing. Her heart pounded in her ears, but her face remained composed. Beatrice circled her slowly. "You think he'll choose you over everything he's built, over his name, his fortune, over me?" "I think," Jennifer whispered, "that he'll choose the truth." Beatrice halted. For a moment, the air between them vibrated with tension too sharp to name, and then Jennifer turned and left the room, her back straight, her breath ragged, the echo of her own words ringing in her ears. It did not take long. That evening, as the snow fell again in soft whirls outside the parlor windows, Nathaniel found Jennifer in the music room. The old pianoforte sat untouched in the corner, its ivory keys yellowed by time. She stood near the hearth, her hands folded, the firelight brushing her cheek in copper and gold. "I heard," he said simply. Jennifer turned, startled. She told me what she offered you." Jennifer nodded, the weight of the confrontation still pressing against her ribs. "I refused." He stepped closer, the space between them diminishing like the wick of a candle. "I know." She lowered her eyes. "I also know what she threatened you with." Her breath caught. Nathaniel's voice deepened. "If she so much as writes a word to a paper, if she so much as speaks your name in slander, I will ruin every avenue she walks." Jennifer looked up, startled by the vehemence in his tone. "I have allowed her too much," he said, "for too long." He crossed to the bell cord, pulled it, and within seconds Mrs. Whitcomb appeared in the doorway. "Fetch Miss Hawthorne," Nathaniel said. "To the study, now." It was not a request. Minutes later, in the study's firelit silence, Beatrice arrived. She swept in, composed as always, though her eyes glittered with restrained fury. "Brother." "Beatrice," Nathaniel said, not rising, "you've overstepped. I've protected—" "No," he interrupted. You've controlled, manipulated, and insulted the only person in this house who has shown my son unconditional love. She's a servant, Beatrice hissed, a nobody, and your infatuation will destroy everything we've preserved. Nathaniel stood slowly, towering in the low light. She is not a nobody. She is the woman who gave my son back to me, and I will not allow you to shame her, threaten her, or write another letter behind closed doors. Beatrice paled. You are no longer mistress of this house, he said, his voice final. You will pack your things, you will leave in the morning, and you will not return. You would exile your own sister for her? No, he said. I am reclaiming what is mine from you. Beatrice trembled, her breath quickening. You're mad. He turned from her. Go. She left in silence. When the door closed, the room seemed to breathe again. Jennifer stepped forward, her voice barely audible. You didn't have to do that. Yes, Nathaniel said, turning to her. I did. He crossed to her slowly, deliberately, then stopped. I made you a promise, he said, but I ask you now, not to accept it yet. She frowned slightly. Why? Because I want no doubts, no whispers, no shadows over what we might become. She swallowed. You mean to protect me? I mean to give you a choice, he said. One that belongs only to you. I will not ask for your hand while others believe you were bought by a vow spoken in desperation. Jennifer's heart twisted. Then what am I to do? She asked, the tremble in her voice finally surfacing. Stand by while the world judges me? Pretend I feel nothing when I see you across the room? He stepped forward again, closer now. No, you are to feel everything, he said. As I do. Their eyes met. For a moment, the entire world narrowed to the heat between them, to the flicker of firelight dancing in his eyes, to the ache that lived in the silence they shared. Jennifer stepped back, trembling, breathless. I don't know if I'm strong enough for what comes next, she whispered. You are, he said. But as he watched her retreat into the hall, he knew she did not yet believe it. And neither did he. The snow had returned with vengeance. It swept across the city in silent, relentless waves, cloaking rooftops and carriages, swallowing the avenues in white. But inside the Hawthorne mansion, the storm that raged was not one born of winter, but of fear. Thomas had fallen ill. It began with a shiver, a flush on his cheeks that no fire could chase away. By evening he was fevered, his small limbs trembling beneath the weight of blankets, his breathing shallow and uneven. The doctor was summoned with haste, arriving soaked in sleet, his spectacles fogged and his hands cold from the storm. He examined the boy and delivered his diagnosis in quiet tones, with eyes that avoided Nathaniel's. Fever, likely an infection. He's weak from weeks of emotional strain, from too little rest and too many silent burdens. It will be a long night, and it was. Jennifer sat beside the bed, a cool cloth in her hand, her skirts gathered neatly beneath her, her heart pounding with each breath the child took. She had braided his damp hair back from his forehead, humming soft notes of lullabies she barely remembered, her voice steady, though her hands trembled. Nathaniel stood behind her, silent but present, his coat discarded, sleeves rolled to his forearms, as if the formality of his life had finally been stripped away. He watched the two of them in silence, watched the way Jennifer leaned toward Thomas with the desperation of someone who had no title but carried more love than any name could grant. The boy moaned, tossing beneath the covers. No, Mama, no, don't go. I'm sorry. Jennifer's breath caught. Thomas's voice was faint, like wind through old curtains, but it was there. Full sentences, tumbling from his lips as though a dam had cracked. Nathaniel knelt beside the bed. Thomas, he whispered, taking the boy's hand. I'm here. You're safe. Don't let her leave, the child sobbed, eyes still shut, face burning. Don't send me away. Nathaniel's hand tightened over his. I won't. Never again. Jennifer rose, unable to hold back the tears that blurred her vision. She turned toward the fire, placing a hand on the mantel as if to steady the room itself. Behind her, the child stirred again. "I didn't mean to be bad," he wept. "I wanted her to stay. I wanted her to sing." Jennifer turned back, kneeling beside Nathaniel. Her hand found Thomas's other one. "You're not bad, Thomas," she whispered. "You're brave. You're stronger than any boy I've ever known." His lashes fluttered. His lips moved. The words barely formed. "Miss Marsh, don't go." "I won't," she said, her voice breaking. "I won't ever leave you." The fever surged again, and he drifted into deeper sleep, whimpering softly. The storm outside howled louder, as if echoing the battle that waged inside the small frame of the boy they both now loved more than their own peace. As hours passed, the room dimmed. Lamps were lowered, and only the fire cast warmth. Nathaniel sat slouched in a nearby chair, his head resting against the carved back, eyes heavy with grief and exhaustion. Jennifer remained on the edge of the bed, her hand still resting near Thomas's. "You should rest," she said softly. He opened his eyes, shaking his head. "I can't." She turned toward him. In the quiet, something shifted. "I used to believe I knew grief," he said. "I thought losing Eleanor had carved out everything inside me that could feel. But I was wrong." She said nothing. He looked at her, truly looked. "When I saw you hold him, when I heard him speak your name through fever and fear, I realized what I feared most wasn't losing Eleanor. It was never feeling anything again." Her heart beat loud in the stillness. "You brought him back," Nathaniel continued, voice thick. "And me too. You became the voice in the silence, the voice that made the house breathe again." Jennifer blinked, tears warming her lashes. He rose slowly, crossing to her with quiet steps, his gaze fixed on hers. The firelight caught the shadows of his face, the sharp lines of weariness, and something softer beneath. When he stopped in front of her, she did not move. His hand reached out, not boldly but as if in reverence, brushing a curl from her cheek. His fingers lingered against her skin. "I want to kiss you," he whispered, "not because of promises or desperation, but because I have no other way to say what this moment means." Jennifer's breath caught. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible, and in the quiet light of the fire, surrounded by fever and snow, they kissed. It was not hurried nor desperate. It was tender, full of fear and relief, of restraint and longing. His hands cupped her face gently, and hers rested over his chest, where his heart beat strong and steady, as though it had only just remembered how to live. They parted slowly, their foreheads pressed together, their eyes closed. A knock came at the door. Jennifer stepped back quickly, adjusting her apron, her breath uneven. Mrs. Whitcomb entered quietly, carrying something in her hand. She did not look surprised. Her expression was unreadable, but her steps were gentle. Without a word, she crossed the room and placed the silver locket, Eleanor's locket, on the bedside table. "For Thomas. When he's ready." She turned to leave, pausing at the door. "The fever is breaking," she said quietly. Jennifer's hand flew to her mouth. Nathaniel exhaled deeply, closing his eyes for a brief moment before walking to the bed and brushing a hand over his son's damp brow. Thomas's breath was calmer now, his sleep less frantic. The worst had passed. Outside the nursery, in the long corridor near the servants' stairwell, a figure lingered in silence. Beatrice. She had come prepared with her papers, with her petition for guardianship sealed and addressed. She had come to deliver judgment, to strike when the house was weakest. But she had stopped at the sound of the boy's voice, a voice not of screams or childish babble, but of emotion, raw, vulnerable, and heartbreakingly human. She had heard her name, and Jennifer's, and a mother's name too, and she had paused. Her hand gripped the stair rail, her lips parted, her face pale in the flickering sconce light. The papers trembled in her satchel, the law was still on her side, society still on her tongue. But she had not expected the boy to speak. She had not expected to feel something break. With slow, measured steps, she turned away from the nursery door and descended the stairs without a word. The petition was never delivered, the satchel never reopened. That night, as the storm slowly faded and the snow fell softer, the Hawthorne mansion felt at last not haunted, but alive. And in the nursery, where firelight danced on the walls and a silver locket caught its glow, a family began to mend, not in grandeur, not in certainty, but in the quiet language of love finally spoken aloud. The mansion on Fifth Avenue shimmered beneath a fresh blanket of snow, its gaslights flickering against the windows like hesitant stars. Inside, the grand foyer was a study in opulence, pine garlands laced with crimson ribbon draped over mahogany arches, the scent of mulled wine mingling with that of beeswax polish and imported perfume. The great Hawthorne holiday reception, once the crown of the winter season, had returned after 2 years of silence, and the city's elite had answered its call. Nathaniel stood near the marble staircase, dressed in his formal black tailcoat, the same one he had not worn since Eleanor's funeral. His silver watch chain gleamed subtly against his waistcoat, and though his posture was straight, his fingers twitched slightly at his side, unseen tremors of the cost this night exacted. He watched the room fill, investors in ivory waistcoats, dowagers in diamonds that caught the chandelier light like snowflakes, and newspapermen with eyes too sharp and smiles too slick. Their presence was not born of affection, but of curiosity and calculation. They had come to witness either the reaffirmation of Nathaniel Hawthorne, Titan of steel, or his unraveling. Mrs. Whitcomb directed footmen with quiet precision, her hair pulled tightly beneath her lace cap. Every canapé, every champagne glass was perfectly aligned. And in the corner, discreet yet omnipresent, Jennifer stood by the library threshold in a modest navy gown with a high collar and mother-of-pearl buttons. Her hair, pulled into a smooth twist, revealed the curve of her neck and the faint shadow of strain behind her eyes. She had never attended such an event, not as a guest nor as a servant, but she was here, and that in itself was a revolution. The string quartet began a gentle waltz. Conversations floated across the room like so many veiled judgments. One woman in a rustling gown of emerald silk leaned toward her companion and murmured, "Isn't that the nursery maid?" Another, younger and sharper, narrowed her eyes toward Jennifer. "She looks almost presentable," she said, as if stunned by her own condescension. Nathaniel overheard neither, but he felt it, the scrutiny, the anticipation. It hung in the air like ice above a pond. He approached Jennifer slowly, as if afraid to startle her from this strange tableau they inhabited. "You don't have to stay," he said gently. She looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to." The words were simple, but in that moment they steadied him more than any contract or profit margin ever had. Across the room, a footman emerged from the east hallway and gave a subtle nod. Nathaniel drew a breath. It was time. He stepped toward the center of the drawing room, raising his hand slightly to signal the quartet to pause. The music faded, replaced by a silence that was far more deafening. "My friends," Nathaniel began, his voice clear but devoid of the flourish others might have employed, "I thank you for joining me this evening. It means more than I can say that you've come, not merely to drink my wine or remember your former admiration, but to see what this house now is." Murmurs stirred. One guest chuckled under his breath. Another raised a brow. Nathaniel pressed on. "For 2 years, this home has lived in shadow. My son and I have endured the weight of grief, each in our own silence. But in that silence, something began to change. Not through business or legacy, but through the presence of someone unexpected." He turned, instinctively seeking Jennifer's gaze. "She brought laughter back to this house," he said. "She brought life." Before another breath could be drawn, the great double doors at the rear of the room creaked open. All heads turned. Standing there, framed by the gold-trimmed panels and the soft light of the hallway, was Thomas. He wore a navy blue sailor suit, his blonde hair neatly combed, the small silver buttons of his jacket shining. A hush fell like snow over the gathering. The child took 2 careful steps forward. "Father," he said. It was a single word, but it carried more weight than any speech given that night. Gasps rippled through the guests. Champagne glasses stilled mid-air. One woman's gloved hand flew to her chest. A gentleman coughed softly into his cravat, unable to mask his astonishment. Nathaniel's knees nearly buckled. He had heard his son speak again in private, but never like this, never so unshaken, never so brave. Thomas then turned his head toward Jennifer. "She made me safe again." His voice was clear, soft, but unwavering. Jennifer's lips parted, her eyes brimmed, and she stepped forward instinctively, but stopped at the edge of the crowd. A long pause followed, and then Nathaniel did something no one expected. He walked to her, through the murmurs, past the stairs. He reached for her hand, not as a benefactor, not as a master of the house, but as a man whose life had been reshaped by love. He lifted her hand gently and turned to face the room. "This is Miss Jennifer Marsh," he said. "She is the reason my son speaks, the reason this house lives again, and the woman I intend to marry." In the statement fell into the room like a stone into still water. Several guests gasped. One elderly matron dropped her fan with a dramatic flutter. A young investor excused himself quietly and disappeared into the corridor. But in the far corner, another man, older, grey-bearded, respected in the steel industry, lifted his glass. He nodded once. "To life, then," he said. It was not a declaration, but it was enough. Others began to stir. A cough here, a whisper there. And then, slowly, the music resumed. The Hawthorne house breathed again. Nathaniel turned to Jennifer, his voice lower now, private. "I'm not sorry," he whispered. "Neither am I," she said. Beside them, Thomas approached, his small hand reaching for both of theirs. His fingers were still warm, with the remnants of fever, but his grip was steady. Mrs. Whitcomb watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes suspiciously moist. She did not smile, but her chin lifted, as if to challenge anyone who dared object. Beatrice was not there. The corridor she had once dominated now held only shadows and forgotten intentions. Later that evening, as guests began to leave in measured pairs, some casting lingering glances at the trio near the fireplace, Jennifer stood at a window watching the snow fall. The city beyond was blurred by frost, but the glass no longer felt like a barrier. Nathaniel joined her, silent for a moment. "I used to think society's approval was the only currency worth protecting," he murmured. "And now?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Now I know the only truth worth protecting is this." He did not point to the wealth around them, nor the contracts recovered. He pointed to his son, and to her, and in that reflection upon the frosted glass, they stood, no longer the maid and the magnate, but a family. Finally seen, finally heard. The morning light filtered gently through the tall parlor windows, gilding the floral moldings with a golden hush. Outside, the city of New York stirred beneath a light snow, its clamor softened by the hush of winter. But within the Hawthorne mansion, the world had paused. The very room where Nathaniel once uttered a desperate promise was now transformed into a sanctuary of fulfillment. Gone were the heavy drapes of mourning. Now, ivory lace adorned the windows, and soft winter roses filled the vases. Pale blooms nestled in silver urns like promises kept. Jennifer stood at the center of it all. Her gown was simple, as she had asked it to be. Modest ivory silk fitted to her slender frame with delicate care, was adorned with hand-stitched lace that once belonged to Eleanor Hawthorne's favorite shawl. Mrs. Whitcomb had offered it quietly, placing it in Jennifer's hands with no speech, only a steady gaze that needed no explanation. It was both a farewell and a blessing. Jennifer's hair was drawn into a low chignon, soft tendrils escaping along her cheekbones. No diamonds sparkled at her throat, only a tiny locket on a ribbon, the same she had once tucked beneath her apron, now resting in plain view. It no longer carried a secret, but a memory a thread between the past and the future. Thomas stood beside her in a small, dark suit, his mittens clutched in one hand, his eyes wide with anticipation and solemn pride. Nathaniel had bent to straighten his lapel not moments before, murmuring something that made the boy smile. Not the timid, uncertain curl of lips from before, but a real, unabashed grin. And Nathaniel, how changed he was. Though still draped in formal black with his velvet cravat and silver cufflinks, his expression was no longer carved in stone. He stood not as a titan of steel, but as a man reborn. The shadows beneath his eyes had softened. His voice, when he turned to face Jennifer, trembled. The officiant's words echoed softly, but no vow spoken that morning matched the unspoken one that had already rooted itself deep between them. One built not on obligation, but on shared grief, laughter, and the slow, redemptive fire of love. When Nathaniel slipped the ring onto her finger, it was a simple gold band that once belonged to his mother. Because it was never about possession, he had told her when offering it, only about legacy. Jennifer's hands trembled, but not with fear. They kissed beneath the carved archway. Not long, not bold, just long enough to feel the world realign. Mrs. Whitcomb dabbed discreetly at her eyes in the corner. The household staff stood in respectful rows behind the parlour chairs, many of them weeping freely. The cook clutched her apron. The youngest footman blinked furiously, and old Mr. Pratt, the gardener, clapped once and then quickly folded his hands. As they turned to face the small gathering, Thomas slid his fingers into theirs, and so they stood, husband, wife, and child, not just joined by ceremony, but by survival. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm both gentle and purposeful. Jennifer did not vanish into drawing rooms and society teas, as some had expected. Instead, she transformed the mansion's former music room, long unused since Eleanor's passing, into something entirely new, a small literacy school open to the children of servants, workers, and anyone else the household employed. The black walnut piano remained against the far wall, but now sat beneath a chalkboard. Shelves of books filled with worn pages and inked annotations lined the paneling. Small desks, each no bigger than a sewing stool, were placed in rows, with glass jars of pencils and slates beside them. Thomas was the first to take a seat, his hands folded neatly as he waited for the others. He helped Jennifer sort primers and illustrated cards, and he smiled each time a child read aloud without stumbling. The other children followed, nervous at first, giggling in hushed tones, but soon eager, bold. Jennifer's voice carried softly through the corridors each morning, reciting letters, words, stories. Laughter began to echo through the mansion again, not in the ballroom, but in this place of learning and hope. Nathaniel often watched from the doorway. There were no lavish galas held that season, no great campaign to restore the Hawthorne name in the eyes of society. Instead, the mansion became something far rarer, a home filled with purpose. A house where learning meant dignity, and every word spoken was a triumph over silence. As winter deepened, the parlour fires burned longer and brighter. Snow dusted the windowsills each morning, and the family grew into itself, like a garden blooming through frost. One afternoon, as the city was quiet beneath a curtain of snow, Nathaniel found Jennifer seated by the fire, correcting a set of childish drawings. She looked up, her fingers smudged with chalk dust. "You built a factory of iron," she said, teasing gently, "and I built one of paper and dreams." He smiled, kneeling beside her. "Yours is stronger." She touched his face, her fingers light as breath. "Because it has your son's laughter in its walls." He rested his forehead against hers. "I never imagined this," he whispered, "not even in my most desperate hours." "You didn't need to," she murmured. "It found you anyway." And in those quiet words, beneath the soft crackle of fire and the hush of snow, the past was finally at peace. Some weeks later, on a Sunday morning when the streets were white and the air still as glass, the three of them stepped out into Central Park. Nathaniel wore a heavy wool coat, his arm linked with Jennifer's. She wore a new cloak in forest green, with fur lining around the hood and sleeves. Nathaniel had insisted she have something of warmth and beauty, something hers. Thomas skipped ahead slightly, dragging a sled behind him, his boots leaving excited prints in the snow. The park was near empty, the city hushed. Trees stood like statues beneath winter's breath. They walked slowly, savoring the stillness, letting each footstep mark their quiet victory. At the top of a small hill, Nathaniel paused and turned to Jennifer. "There's something I haven't said." She looked at him with steady curiosity. "All this time," he continued, "this house, this name, everything bore the weight of Eleanor's absence. But now, finally, it feels named again." "Named for whom?" she asked gently. "For you." A gust of wind sent snow drifting between them. She leaned into him, not for warmth, but for grounding. He looked toward Thomas, who was now calling to them to join him, and then back to her. "You've given us something no name ever carried," he said. "A future." And together they walked forward, leaving behind the weight of silence, stepping into a life where every breath was a choice, every word a gift. In the snow behind them, 3 sets of footprints stretched side by side, no longer just a house on Fifth Avenue, but a place with her name. The year was 1893, and the world outside had changed. Steel bridges now arched across the East River. Electric lamps lit the avenues where once only gaslight flickered. But in the quiet stretch of Fifth Avenue, just beyond the noise, the Hawthorne residence stood much the same, solid, proud, and wrapped in ivy that had turned silver in the winter frost. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and coal filled the warm air. A fire crackled gently in the hearth of the drawing room, where Jennifer sat at her writing desk, her hand poised over a sheet of thick linen paper. A faded locket hung still at her neck, no longer hidden, no longer secret. The walls around her had softened with time, no longer a fortress of silence, but a home filled with laughter and meaning. Down the hallway, children's voices echoed like bells. 6 years had passed since the day she and Nathaniel vowed to begin again, and time had kept its promise. Their daughter Eleanor, named not in memory of mourning but in tribute to grace, was 5 now, a flame-haired spirit with Nathaniel's deep gaze and Jennifer's quiet stubbornness. And Thomas, now 12, had grown into a tall, solemn boy who carried his silence not as a burden, but as a strength earned. He had never stopped calling Jennifer Mama. The literacy school had expanded. What began as a small room of chalkboards and storybooks had become a modest but thriving institution. 2 more teachers had joined her mission. Former servants' children now read Shakespeare and wrote essays about democracy. Thomas helped tutor the younger ones after finishing his own schoolwork, and each week Jennifer received letters from young women, former pupils now working as secretaries, journalists and nurses. Change had come slowly, but it had come. Society still whispered, of course. Some invitations never arrived, some names never spoke hers in polite circles. But Nathaniel's contracts had weathered the scandal, his company had grown, and his alliances had shifted from socialites to thinkers, educators, and reformers. Those who once questioned her place now sent their daughters to her school. Beatrice had not returned. Her name had faded from the guest lists, from the family ledger, and from the conversations whispered behind velvet fans. It was said she moved to Boston, that she lived alone, her name spoken in stiff tones at the occasional church function. Nathaniel never spoke of her, and Jennifer never asked. Some silences, after all, were sacred. Nathaniel entered the room quietly now, brushing snow from his shoulders. His hair had silvered at the temples, and a new gravity touched his walk, but his eyes lit in the same way each time they met hers. He walked past the mantel, where 2 stockings hung, one with Eleanor's initials embroidered by Jennifer's own hand, the other older, marked simply T. He placed a kiss atop Jennifer's head, then leaned against the desk. Thomas took the sled out again, he said with mock resignation. Eleanor insisted on pulling him. Jennifer smiled. She's 5. He's almost as tall as you, and just as impossible. They shared a glance that held years within it. "You're writing again," he said, nodding to the pages. "A letter to a girl named Aileen. She was just hired at the post office downtown, first in her family to read." Nathaniel bent and kissed her hand. "You've built more than I ever did." "I built because of what you gave me." He looked down at her fingers, still ink-stained, still strong. "You gave me a home," he said. "You gave Thomas a voice, and you gave us both a life I never thought we deserved." Outside, snowflakes danced against the glass. The city pulsed, shifting with progress, glowing faintly in the distance. And yet, here, the world felt untouched by time. Thomas's laughter rang out from the street below, joined by Eleanor's shrieks of delight as the sled met a bank of snow. Jennifer and Nathaniel rose and walked to the window, watching their children framed against the snowy dusk. "I used to believe some names carried weight like chains," Nathaniel said softly. "But now I know. The weight only mattered until it was carried by love." Jennifer leaned into him. "And love, when true, never rusts. It bends, it bears, but it never breaks." They stood together, warm against the pain, hearts pressed to glass, watching the legacy of all they had survived and all they had built unfold in the laughter of the next generation. Outside, the world raced ahead. Inside, love remained. What if the greatest promises were not the ones spoken aloud, but the ones fulfilled in silence, through tenderness, courage, and resilience? Jennifer's journey reminds us that love doesn't always arrive with grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it begins in the quiet corners of grief, in whispered lullabies, in small acts of kindness that build a home stronger than steel. Nathaniel thought his heart had turned to iron, until she taught him to feel again. And Thomas, a child silenced by sorrow, found his voice not through force, but through the steady, patient love of a woman the world never expected to matter. This story is more than a romance. It's a reminder that healing takes time, that love grows not in perfection but in choice, chosen again and again across years, despite doubt, through fire and snow. If this story touched you, tell us, what did it awaken in you? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you made it to the very end, write the word whisper down below, so we know you felt every emotion with us until the final breath. If you'd like to help us continue creating these emotional, richly woven period romances, consider leaving a super thanks here on YouTube. Any amount, big or small, helps us keep these timeless stories alive. And if supporting financially isn't possible right now, simply sharing this video with someone who loves historical love stories is already a beautiful way to help. Don't forget to explore the other stories waiting for you in the cards above. Each one filled with unforgettable emotions, breathtaking drama, and love that stands the test of time. Thank you, from the heart, for walking with us through every season of this story.